Hello, and welcome to the Real American Revolution, a multimedia program to discuss what really happened before, during, and after America's War for Independence. My name is Randy Flood, and today my guest is Dr. Stephen Brumwell, who's joining us from his home in Amsterdam, Netherlands. Dr. Brumwell is an award-winning British freelance writer and independent historian who earned his PhD in history from the University of Leeds. A former newspaper journalist, he's the author of several acclaimed books examining aspects of Anglo-American military history in the second half of the 18th century. They include Redcoats, the British Soldier and the War in Americas from 1755 to 1763, White Devil, a true story of war, savagery, and vengeance in colonial America, and George Washington, Gentleman Warrior, which, by the way, won the 2013 George Washington Book Prize. His most recent book, Turncoat, Benedict Arnold and the Crisis of American Liberty, was published in 2018 by Yale University Press. Stephen is also a regular reviewer of history titles for the Wall Street Journal and has been featured as an on-screen expert in the Smithsonian Channel series, America's Hidden Stories. Today, Stephen and I will be talking about his two books that were set during the French and Indian War in America, Redcoats and White Devil, respectively. So, Stephen, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Randy.
Well, Stephen, let's talk first about Redcoats. Like many Americans, when I first think of the British troops in the colonies, I think of movies such as The Last of the Mohegans during the French and Indian War, when we liked the British, or the movie The Patriot, when we disliked them. Redcoats was primarily based upon your doctoral dissertation. So what motivated you to really expand your study into a book?
Well, you mentioned earlier that my background was as a newspaper man. So when I went to university and ended up doing research, I always had this notion that I would like to actually publish what I found and try and get it out there to a kind of a non-academic readership, if possible. So I always had that in the back of my mind when I was writing my PhD. Basically, also what I wanted to try and do was challenge the stereotypes. And you mentioned two well-known films, one set in the French and Indian War, one set in the Revolutionary War. And both of them really have this image of the British soldier as pretty much marching around in rank and file, cannon fodder or musket fodder, respectively, for either the Native Americans led by the Canny Magua or the good old Continental Army or militia led by Mel Gibson, the Mel Gibson character. So in both of those films, what you've got is this stereotype view of people who are almost this kind of automaton, really, just presenting themselves as targets, not really doing anything other than just blindly obeying their officers, marching to their doom. So as I started researching the subject, of course, what you find as you go through the evidence is that the image that people have very much in their mind isn't always that close to the reality of what really happened. Now, that's not to suggest that some of that imagery isn't correct. If you look at another well-known film featuring that period, Barry Lyndon, Stanley Kubrick's great masterpiece, there's a very famous sequence which shows British redcoats advancing against a French position, basically accepting casualties and just moving forward. And of course, warfare in Europe very much did have to be based upon those notions of discipline where your ability to sustain casualties outweighed the enemy's ability to do so. And so basically it was really a question of who was the better disciplined, better motivated forces. So there is an element of truth in that. But of course, when the British Army was obliged to operate in a very unfamiliar environment in North America, it had to learn how to adapt to local conditions. And so that really was something I was particularly interested in exploring. So basically, I think Redcoats, my motivation for writing Redcoats was almost a kind of a case study in how an institution has to adapt to unfamiliar conditions, how successful is it in that facing that challenge?
Mhm. Well, let's talk about that. You talk about unfamiliar challenges that were faced by the British Army and the Americans. How did they adapt to that?
Well, if we look at if we look at the challenges themselves, so the first challenge really is the environment itself. A lot of what went on, and my backdrop, of course, features Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York. And if
Mhm.
you were to stand on those ramparts behind me and look out, you'd see, of course, Great Lakes, expanses of water. You'd see, uh, in fact, far heavier forests than there is now. You would see mountainous terrain. So just to get to Fort Ticonderoga, if you're a British Army based in Albany or New York, you have to get up the Hudson, you have to get to French-held Ticonderoga. But you've actually got to negotiate the wilderness effectively. So you've got to have people who are capable of getting you there, getting you through the forest, capable of using bateau to cross the lakes. You've got to be able to move your artillery. Uh, this isn't like operating in Flanders or Germany, the Low Countries, which are in
Mhm.
Flanders, it literally is the Low Countries, pretty flat. This is very, very different. So you've actually got to negotiate the terrain, and sometimes you've got to do that in winter as well, when there's snow on the ground.
Mhm.
So if you've never used snowshoes before, you've got to learn how to use snowshoes. And of course, in North America, you're not only fighting French regular troops who fight in pretty much the same way as you, but you're also coming up against irregular troops who you won't have encountered before. Native American Indian warriors, French Canadian militia, who are pretty much as adept at
Mhm.
wilderness style fighting as Indians themselves. And
Mhm.
also, you're encountering French colonial troops who've been in country for long enough to know how to operate effectively alongside the Native Americans and French Canadian militia.
Mhm.
So that's quite a big challenge. And of course,
Mhm.
the the Indians and the Canadian militia, they're adept at what is known as bushfighting. This is something which the British Army in 1755 isn't particularly familiar with. The British Army in its European campaigns has come up against what we would call irregular forces, people who adopt a more skirmishing style of warfare. But the irregular warfare in North America was very different in the sense that aspects of it were extremely unnerving for people who are unfamiliar with them. For example, the fact that if you were left wounded on the field of battle, you wouldn't be picked up, taken off, looked after. There were good chances were you would be knocked on the head with a club or a hatchet, or if you were particularly unlucky, taken away and killed rather more slowly. Or
Mhm.
and this whole psychological aspect of the war whoop that was used by the Native Americans is something you find reported in newspapers in New York and Boston and back in London and Edinburgh, because it's something that made a real impact on survivors. And the fact that
Mhm.
they came across comrades who'd been scalped or otherwise mutilated. Bad things happened, of course, in European warfare. If you got in the way of a round shot or a round of grape shot, you weren't going to look too good. But this was a different kind
Mhm.
of warfare, which had a sort of a psychological element that British troops straight off the transport ship weren't used to. So the real issue was, and this is a major theme of Redcoats, it was like, how do you adapt to those
Mhm.
challenges? And of course, it's a learning process. It's not something that can happen overnight. It's something that has to be learned on the job over a matter of years. And for the British Army from 1775 to 1758, it's a long and often very bloody learning process, going
Mhm.
from Braddock's defeat in 1755, which is often seen as the classic encounter between European
Mhm.
style warfare and American wilderness warfare, where the British suffer a very, very heavy defeat because basically they're unfamiliar with that sort of those style of tactics. Although, interestingly enough, Braddock himself had gone to considerable lengths to try and adapt his troops as best he could for what they might meet. But of course, when the encounter itself actually happened, it was still very different and very unnerving from the more familiar European style warfare. And in during years, what you basically have is a situation where the British Army is acknowledging that there is a problem, but they're trying to think, well, okay, how do we deal with this problem? Initially, even going right back to Braddock, what the British Army had hoped and expected was that they would be able to recruit Indian allies of their own. But for various reasons, often to do with colonial friction with tribes in their particular regions, it was never possible in the earlier years of the war to recruit significant numbers of Native American allies. So that was something which wasn't really viable. Another option, which we'll talk about a little bit more later when we come to look at White Devil, was to use locally recruited rangers, these being provincial forces or American forces, which were more specialized in the sense that they were recruited from men initially, at least, who were far more familiar with the frontier environment, far more familiar with wilderness style warfare. Now, a third option was to actually train your own men, your own regular redcoats, to learn how to fight in the wilderness. And ultimately, this led to volunteers from the regulars going out with the rangers to learn ranging techniques. And famously, Brigadier General George Augustus Lord Howe was someone who was a big fan of the Rangers and went out on scout with them, like many more junior officers did, to try and learn their techniques. Unfortunately, Lord Howe was killed in 1758, not far from Ticonderoga. And he was someone who had been a kind of a great evangelist, if you like, for this whole idea of irregular warfare. But even after Howe's death, or in fact, that very same time, but in a different part of the continent, at Cape Breton, the British were experimenting with light infantry, as it was known, light infantry companies of their own, where men from each battalion, a certain number, maybe sort of 70 men from each battalion, were selected either because they were particularly fit or they were agile or they were particularly good marksmen. And they were put together into a sort of a light infantry battalion and trained in different techniques. So from 1758 onwards, you've got the evolution of light infantry companies. And before long, each battalion has its own light infantry company. Basically, a battalion consists of 10 companies, one of which is grenadiers. But after 1758, you start also to see a light infantry company. What tends to happen on campaign is that the grenadiers and the light infantry are often massed together into sort of larger groups to be used as almost like commando type elite forces, special forces, if you like. So you've got these three different ways of trying to solve the problem. But ultimately, by 1759, the British Army in North America has actually managed to take on board a certain number of Iroquois warriors. So it's actually got a reasonable contingent of Indian warriors in certain campaigns. Not every campaign. For example, Wolfe at Quebec has no Indians at all. But he does have rangers and he does have specialist, well-trained light infantry. And by the Quebec campaign, you're seeing the light infantry really being used as commando type forces. These are the guys who lead the way up the cliff to the Plains of Abraham. When they get to the Plains of Abraham, they are there countering the French Indians and the French militia. So by 1759, the British Army has really kind of gone quite a long way to adapting itself to meeting the challenges of North America.
Right.
That's not to say that it's always successful.
Hmm.
Disasters still happen, but basically the army by 1759 is very different from the army of 1755. And I think that's quite a remarkable achievement. Although, as I emphasized before, it was by no means an easy, painless process.
Yeah. Transformation in a very short period of time.
Well, yeah, and
Yeah.
but what I think it does show is that this stereotypical view of the British Army as being led by, criminals, the sweepings of the
Right.
jails, being led by aristocrats who were more interested in powdering their noses and taking snuff than actually getting to grips with the nitty gritty is
Hmm.
untrue. If
Right.
that had been the case, there's no way that people like Wolfe and Amherst could have been achieving what they did achieve.
Hmm.
So I think really, to me, that's always, as soon as I started researching the subject, I thought, well, hang on, these stereotypes just can't really be true,
Hmm.
because if they were true, why would the British Army have achieved what it did? I think
Hmm.
people tend to focus on the early disasters and assume that that was how it was, but then they don't really think, well, in that case, how did the British Army ultimately beat the French, who were
Hmm.
so good at waging
Hmm.
that kind of warfare?
I guess a little bit it had to deal with the commanders as well. You mentioned Lord Howe, who got along very well with Robert Rogers and the Rangers, and really understood that American mindset, if you will, of warfare. Who were some of the other commanders that made that adaptation much more readily? I know that some were pretty resistant to it and were falling back in the older way of European fighting, but some of them were not quite as enlightened as Lord Howe, but were moving in that direction, and I think probably had a lot to do with the transition that was successful for the British. Could you talk about some of those other commanders and the degree to which they were accepting the American style of fighting?
Yeah, I mean, one of the best examples, I think, is General John Forbes, who in fact led the campaign in 1758,
Hmm.
which succeeded where Braddock had failed and actually captured Fort Duquesne. Interestingly enough, John Forbes, who was a Scotsman, he was a former cavalryman, and he'd had quite a conventional background in the sense he'd been adjutant general in Flanders. So he'd seen his background was in the very conventional warfare during the War of the Austrian Succession during the 1740s, where you saw these huge Napoleonic scale confrontations between conventional armies. Now, he was someone who was a very good administrator. So when he was sent to America, he was someone who, basically he was a bit of a logistics expert. And of course, if you're getting your army through the wilderness to Fort Duquesne, you've got to be someone who knows how to
Hmm.
organize wagon contracts, to get the right amount of supplies. And he established fortified base camps, basically, so he could move his troops from in a sort of a protected advance. So there was always a fallback position. But he was also someone who was very realistic. He basically said, in America, we need to uh, learn the lessons of war from those who've actually been
Hmm.
practicing it. So he was very receptive to any ideas, like, for example, okay, why don't we equip some of our men like Indians? Because this was another campaign where, although there'd initially been a reasonable contingent of warriors accompanying the campaign, they had basically been alienated by the way they'd been treated. So Forbes was ultimately left with a small number of allied Indian warriors, so he had to find substitutes. Now he had his campaign consisted of a mixture of regular red-coated troops,
Hmm.
but the bulk of his manpower was actually colonial provincial troops, who were like a kind of a halfway house between militia and regular forces. They enlisted for an entire campaign, but they weren't as well trained by a long stretch as the regular troops.
Hmm.
But they included people who were more familiar with the frontier environment. They were people who recruited in Pennsylvania, Virginia, and so Forbes was receptive to suggestions that some of these provincials should actually dress like Indians and be equipped like Indians, and to actually basically operate in the same way as Indians. So he was someone who, although he came from a very conventional background, was willing to adapt. Forbes succeeded in taking Fort Duquesne. Unfortunately, he was very seriously ill throughout the campaign, probably with stomach cancer, and he actually died shortly afterwards. So the British Army lost one of its most capable fighters. Like Lord Howe, it's interesting to speculate on whether in the coming conflict, the Revolutionary War, whether these kind of officers with the background they had, who were both relatively young when they died, would have been the kind of game changers for the British Army in North America. But that's, of course, speculation. They could have ended up being British officers who decided they wanted to fight on the rebel side, as others did. We just don't know. But Forbes is a good example. One of the officers that Forbes operated alongside, Henri Bouquet, was actually a Swiss officer who, like a lot of foreign officers, joined the so-called Royal American Regiment. And Bouquet was someone, again, who came from a background which was pretty conventional, but he immediately realized that in America, as he put it, the enemies we have to deal with in terms of irregulars are far more formidable than the ones we've had to deal with in Europe. And he was talking about the contrast between Croats, Pandors, people like that, used by some of the European forces, and the Native American warriors. And Henri Bouquet would go on to win one of the most celebrated encounters between regular forces and Native Americans, the Battle of Bushy Run in 1763. I say win, basically it was more a question, really more of a question of he managed to get his command out of the situation without it being massacred, and they rebuffed the Indian assault. But it was an example of how much had changed between the days of Braddock and events in 1763. Again, Henri Bouquet unfortunately died not long after Bushy Run of fever, and again the British Army lost another very capable officer. Even someone like James Wolfe, who could be very scathing of Native Americans, very scathing also of provincials and even the Rangers. He was someone who realized that war in America was a very different business. Even if you didn't think very much of Indians, very much of Rangers, you still had to acknowledge the fact that you were going to come up against irregular forces, and you had to have troops of your own who were capable of dealing with them. And Wolfe was a real exponent of light infantry, and he realized that yes, you had to take this threat seriously. You had to be have troops who were capable of both fighting in the conventional methods of Europe, because you were going to come up against French regulars sooner or later, and there was no point having troops who were so irregular that they couldn't fight in the traditional way. And you had to have either the same troops or elements of your forces who were capable of taking on the irregulars. And as I mentioned before, unlike Amherst in 1759, Wolfe didn't have any Native American allies. So it's interesting to contrast his campaign with what was going on other fronts, like at Niagara, for example, where there were Native American allies, because I think it shows how well trained and adaptable Wolfe's own regular light troops were, because they were capable of at least taking on the French irregulars, and on some occasions actually beating them as well.
Well, an important component of the British Army, of course, were the Highland Scots. And you mentioned Edinburgh, you mentioned John Forbes. How did the Highland Scots, how did they help the British war effort in the Americas?
Yeah, I think in my book Redcoats, I devote an entire chapter to the Highlanders, because I think they were made a very significant contribution to the British Army. And also, I think they're one of the most distinctive elements. You know, the Highland Scot has become kind of an iconic military figure. And I would argue that the contribution of Scottish Highlanders to the British Army in the French and Indian War was really the beginning, the true beginning of the acceptance of Highlanders as soldiers within the British Army. And of course, we're very familiar with Highlanders at Waterloo, for example, in the colonial campaigns, in the Crimean War, for example. There's a lot of very famous paintings of Highlanders. And it got to the stage in the British Army where non-Highland units were getting kind of rather miffed that the Highlanders were always getting mentioned in dispatches when they weren't. But they became, as I mentioned, iconic figures. But it's interesting when you think about the French and Indian War, Highlanders start being used in America from kind of 1756 onwards. That's only 10 years after the Battle of Culloden, where a Jacobite rebellion in which Highland Scots had featured prominently had been put down by the British Army, many of whose officers including people like James Wolfe, were subsequently serving alongside Highlanders in North America. Not every Highlander, of course, who fought in the French and Indian War had been an active Jacobite 10 years earlier. Many of them were too young, but there were men fighting in the British Army in North America, both officers and other ranks, who actually had been former Jacobites fighting against the British Army. And it's interesting, I think, the way that the British Army looked at things in 1756 was they badly needed manpower. And they were aware that the Highlands of Scotland offered a kind of a reservoir of manpower. And there were chieftains, lairds in the Highlands, even those who'd fought for Bonnie Prince Charlie 10 years earlier, who wanted to basically get back in the good books of the Hanoverian regime. One way to do that was to recruit a battalion, a company or a battalion of Highlanders who would then go and serve King George II in North America. And that was basically a way of redeeming your family's fortunes. And certain chieftains were able to basically exert influence in various ways, or pressure is another way of putting it, upon their tenants to recruit battalions which subsequently served in America. There was already an existing Highland regiment, the very famous Black Watch, which had previously fought in the as a regimented unit in the War of the Austrian Succession. But during the French and Indian War, we actually see not only an expansion of the Black Watch itself into 2 battalions, but we see the raising of battalions specifically for North American service. You've got Montgomery's Highlanders, which becomes the 77th Regiment, and you've got Fraser's Highlanders, 78th. And all 3 of those Highland units see very extensive service. The Black Watch famously lost almost 50% of its manpower in attack on the French lines at Fort Ticonderoga. Fraser's Highlanders fought, they were the largest single battalion in Wolfe's army at Quebec, and they played a very conspicuous role in the Quebec campaign. Montgomery's Highlanders were amongst those units that John Forbes led against Fort Duquesne. So on all fronts, really, the Highland units played a significant role. And in fact, if you look at the manpower of the army in 1758, Highlanders in Highland regiments make up about 1/5 of the manpower. And then it's interesting also to remember that Highlanders also served in other Redcoat regiments, not just in the Highland battalions. So the actual contribution was far higher than that. And I think because the Highlanders fought in celebrated engagements like Ticonderoga, Quebec, and also Bushy Run, Bouquet at Bushy Run, the bulk of his manpower was from the Black Watch and from Montgomery's Highlanders. And these were guys who just come back from the siege of Havana and had been very badly hit by tropical diseases. A lot of them still very feverish, but Bouquet says, well, the Highlanders are the bravest soldiers I've ever known. These were the guys who basically fought off the Indians at Bushy Run.
Hmm.
So they established a reputation during the French and Indian War, which was really the bedrock of what would go on to be the kind of the martial reputation of the Highlanders as part of the British Army.
Hmm. Interesting. Well, Stephen, during our French and Indian War, the American colonies seemed to be grateful to the British Army for helping to protect them against the French and Indians and during that time period. But as time went on, that respect and admiration really deteriorated very quickly. Why did that happen? What do you attribute that to?
Well, in 1763, when the French and Indian War officially ended, the reputation of the British Army in North America was much, much higher than it had been back in 1755, when the British forces had basically been kind of mocked and lambasted for their very poor performance. By 1763, it was acknowledged that basically it was the British Army that had got rid of the French. And the British Army, it's interesting that Massachusetts Bay subscribes for a monument to Lord Howe, for example, in Westminster Abbey. So at that point in time, the British Army it seemed to have done a good job, and they are the ones who have freed colonial Americans from the long-standing threat of French Canada. But within a few years, that had changed. And of course, it's ironic that the cost of the war had to be paid for. It wasn't only won in the blood of the troops who had taken part. It had to be paid for. There was a big debt accumulated to get the French out of Canada. And one of the things which the successive British ministries did in London was say, well, okay, we need to clear the slate. One way we can do this is by starting to get some revenue out of those colonists who we actually went to defend, which seemed, of course, perfectly fair from the prospect, from the attitude of the politicians in London. But the way they went about it, by actually trying to stick taxes on paper, for example, the stamp tax, and you got sugar tax, trying to get revenue in various ways. The colonists thought, well, hang on, but we're not actually represented in London. We're not represented in Parliament. We don't have our own MPs, so we can't be taxed without representation. So you have this whole question of gradually, over a period of 10, 12 years, successive legislation provoking resistance. And then you've got episodes like 1770, March 1770, the Boston Massacre, where British troops in Boston, who are there to try and deal with growing unrest, end up in an armed confrontation where five protesters are actually killed. The Boston Massacre. Of course, this is a propaganda gift for those who are trying to galvanize opposition to British policies. Now, just 7 years after British soldiers have been hailed as the real kind of saints of the colonists, they're now being portrayed as sinners. These are the bad guys now. They've gone from the good guys to the bad guys. And of course, within 5 years of the Boston Massacre, we've actually got armed confrontation at Lexington and Concord. So essentially, British soldiers have become cast as the bogeymen as a result of British policies to try and pay for the French and Indian War.
Interesting. Well, as you look back in your research, what's the most important thing that a reader needs to take away from your book, Redcoats? Is there any single feature that you think is really important that they should retain?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is just to not always just believe what you're shown, what becomes the commonly accepted picture. I mean, despite me having written a book like Redcoats, I'm sure there are plenty of people out there who still think that British soldiers, powdered their hair, marched about the forests in straight lines with shouldered muskets, waiting to be shot and scalped by the Indians. So I think the most important thing is to just try and adopt a slightly more skeptical attitude and just say, hang on, these stereotypes, these cliches, how based in reality are they? Is there a different way of looking at this picture? And I think, yeah, basically, it's a question of looking beyond the cliches. That's what I would say. It's just
Hmm.
thinking more carefully about the way things are portrayed, and just trying to think more logically, and just maybe approaching things just with a bit more common sense.
Hmm.
I think, well, okay, well, if these guys really were so bad, how come they ended up winning the war? I mean, the war wasn't won by Daniel Day-Lewis and his,
Right.
frontiersmen running around the forest. They were
Right.
there, or people like them were there, but they didn't win the war. The war was won by those guys in the Redcoats, and
Mhm.
it was won because they learned hard lessons, which they actually put into practice.
Interesting. Interesting. Let's pause for a minute and then we can go into the second book very quickly. All right.
Okay, I'll take a slug of water. It is only water, I assure you.
Yeah. I'm drinking from my Samuel Smith's glass of water as well.
Oh, nice. Yeah, you got a proper pint,
Proper
sandwiches
pint.
pint glass.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
look at that.
Yeah.
Yes,
When I
nice.
was in England, I loved pub hopping.
Yeah.
So
Oh, yeah. So do I.
yeah,
It's one of the best things to do.
I was actually in Leeds, stayed with a family. I was involved in the JC International organization. And back in the 1983, 84 period, I was in the 83, I was in Scotland in Aberdeen. And then later on, was in London and spent some time in Leeds with a family there. And it was really a terrific opportunity to interact with people that lived in Great Britain and, that entire
Yeah,
community.
yeah.
It's terrific.
Well, I know Leeds well. As you know, I
Yeah.
studied in Leeds. I was there for 10 years, really. And so I got to know Leeds very well. And there's some good pubs there. I'm sure you went to Whitelocks, which is tucked away
Uh-huh.
down an alleyway.
Right. Absolutely.
And it's one of those pubs where they say, well, Dick Turpin drank here. And it's one of the few pubs where he actually could have drunk because it's old enough. And, he had links with connections with York, which isn't too far away.
Mhm.
So I like to think that he possibly did.
Yeah, absolutely. York Minster was terrific as well, I have to
Yeah,
say. Yeah, really
yeah.
neat. So,
If you get there for evensong, it can be incredibly atmospheric. Yeah.
mhm, interesting. Well, Stephen, the second book also deals with the French and Indian War period. So let's discuss White Devil. It's the true story of war, savagery, and vengeance in colonial America. Now, primarily focusing on Robert Rogers and his Rangers, you tell the story of the raid of the Abenaki tribe, located on the southern shore of the St. Lawrence River at St. Francis, in what was then the province of Canada, in early October of 1759 when that raid occurred. How did you develop an interest in Robert Rogers, and what led you to write about this particular exploit of Robert Rogers and his Rangers?
Yeah. Rogers really was this project was a kind of a logical follow-on, I guess, to Redcoats, because I looked at the Rangers when I was writing Redcoats, and I'd always been interested in the character of Robert Rogers. But what particularly drew me to taking a closer look at him was the fact that he was a figure who seemed to polarize opinion so much. You've got what you might call the kind of the old school writers who looked at the frontier era, for whom Rogers epitomized that kind of can-do frontier spirit. He was almost a kind of a larger than life figure. And then you've got a reaction to that portrayal in the 20th century, when historians become far more interested in trying to portray the Native American perspective on what had happened. People like Rogers tended to be seen far more as the bad guys rather than the good guys. So I was interested in the way you've got these two poles of opinion. And once again, I thought to myself, well, if you actually look at what happened, surely the situation can't be that clear cut. And there must be some kind of middle ground. So I was drawn to the idea of looking at Rogers, and in particular looking at the St. Francis raid of 1759, because that again polarized opinion. some people saw it as this kind of heroic exploit, which really was the ultimate deed of daring do, wiping out these bunch of Native Americans who've been preying on white settlers for many years. Or if you go to the other extreme, it's seen as a kind of a war crime committed against women, children, as well as men by a bunch of renegade thugs who shouldn't be celebrated at all.
Mhm.
So once again, I think to myself, as a historian, and also someone with a background in journalism who wants to actually dig into the story a bit more deeply, what really happened? Is it possible to challenge the perceptions and to sort of get to a narrative of what happened, which, even though you can't reveal the entire truth, actually shows a far more realistic picture of what went on? So really, that was my goal. It was to try and strip away the bias, the legend and the bias, and to actually go back to the original documentation, such as survives, and to say, okay, looking at this from the point of view of a historian and as a journalist, can we reconstruct events in a more
Mhm.
balanced, more convincing way? That
Mhm.
was my objective.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, why was Rogers called White Devil?
Well, the title for the book was something that I picked up actually when I was at Ticonderoga. Once again, it's a good time with a backdrop here. I'd gone to Ticonderoga to talk about the British Army, and whilst I was there, I met one of the fort's costumed interpreters, Wes Dykeman, who is himself Sokogi, St. Francis Abenaki in terms of his heritage. And so he was at the fort as a costumed interpreter to give the kind of the Abenaki perspective on events in that region. So I was chatting to Wes about Robert Rogers, because this was something then I was thinking about writing about. And he said, oh yes, of course, for the Abenaki, Rogers will always be Wobomagonda, the White Devil. So it's a way in which the fact that Rogers had attacked their village, had destroyed their village all those years ago, was something that was still remembered. And of course, White Devil is a name with kind of two connotations in a way. In one sense, of course, it's very sinister. It's a way of saying, oh my God, this is someone who did a bad thing. But at the same time, it carries a certain element of respect in the sense of this is someone who actually managed to reach our village miles and miles and miles behind French lines and to destroy it, which is a considerable feat, whatever you think about the ethics of what went on.
Mhm.
So yeah, that was something also that intrigued me, because the ambivalence, if you like, of that name was something which I think went to the very heart of what I was writing about.
Mhm. Stephen, what explains the rise and perhaps the enduring fame of Robert Rogers? And to that end, what role did Francis Parkman, the famous author of the Oregon Trail, play in Americans having a different view of Robert Rogers?
Yeah. Okay. Well, to go back to how Rogers had this kind of meteoric rise in the first place. Let's think about it. He was in his 20s back in sort of 1755, 56 when he starts to come to prominence. And it's interesting to trace his rise because you can see it in the colonial American newspapers. And I think this is an important point because the rise of Robert Rogers coincides with the rise of the colonial newspaper industry, where virtually every colony now has its own news outlet, its own newspaper, and some colonies have more than one newspaper. New York and Boston, for example, Massachusetts, I should say, have more than one newspaper, and these newspapers are hungry for news. And at the start of the French and Indian War, the news they were printing wasn't always that good in terms of how the war was going. So Rogers, you start to see him appearing in reports of often initially just quite small scouting operations. Then he starts to get more coverage. And then as he starts to lead several companies of Rangers, he starts to get half a page, if you like, with his name in bold type. And now it is the brave Captain Rogers, and ultimately it's the brave Major Rogers. So Rogers himself, besides being very adept at frontier warfare, is also no slouch when it comes to writing dispatches. And his reports are actually very coherent, readable, they're interesting. So for someone who's having their breakfast in Boston or London or Edinburgh or Philadelphia, who's had no contact at all with frontier warfare, suddenly they're reading these very gritty, interesting accounts from the man who was actually there on the spot. And so he is his own best self-publicist. And when I say self-publicist, he isn't necessarily exaggerating too much what is going on. He's reporting these events in a pretty matter-of-fact way, but these are very effective, very well publicized, and because they're well written, they are picked up by virtually every newspaper out there who will just use the same report. So Rogers is becoming a celebrity in his 20s. By 1759, when he leads the raid on St. Francis, for example, he's far better known in the North American colonies than George Washington. I think that gives you an indication of the level of celebrity he'd achieved. And he's someone who's been spoken about back in London as well. This is why someone like Geoffrey Amherst, the commander-in-chief, British commander-in-chief in North America, is willing to consult Rogers and is willing to expand the Ranger Corps, because Rogers is someone who is known to by people like William Pitt, the Prime Minister back in London. And so he's someone who's actually got a lot of clout. Now, to cut a long story short, at the end of the French and Indian War, Rogers's star is in rapid decline. He has bad investments. He gets accused of being a traitor, basically, and he gets into a lot of debt. He starts drinking very heavily. So by 1775, when war erupts between Britain and her American colonies, Rogers is not quite sure which side he's going to back. There are suggestions that he does initially want to serve the Patriot cause, but Washington is suspicious of Rogers for various reasons. So Rogers ultimately throws in his lot with the British, but by now Rogers is a shadow of his former self, despite his enduring reputation from the French and Indian War. He's no longer the man he was. His character has been shot to bits by the various hardships, the various disappointments he's labored under. So ultimately, he doesn't have a very good Revolutionary War. He ends up in London and he dies pretty much forgotten, an alcoholic. It's a tragic story. So that is the situation in the 1790s. But Rogers, his legacy still doesn't quite disappear in North America. You have places in the landscape which are associated with him, famously on Lake George, Rogers Rock, Rogers Slide, where legend has it that he actually managed somehow to escape pursuit by coming down this almost sheer rock face to the frozen lake below. You have people, old Rangers, survivors from the French and Indian War, who are being sought out by historians and interviewed. And most importantly, as you mentioned the historian Francis Parkman. In the 1840s, when he was a young man, he spent a summer exploring the sites of Rogers' exploits in the French and Indian War. And he would use that information later in a book called Montcalm and Wolfe, which became a bestseller of narrative history, and it's still in print today. which goes to show what an impact it had. And Francis Parkman, who again was a very good writer as well as a good researcher, was fascinated by Robert Rogers, and his description of Rogers and the Rangers is one of the highlights of Montcalm Wolfe. So really, Parkman was responsible for somehow rehabilitating Rogers, despite the fact he'd backed the British during the Revolutionary War, unlike other Ranger officers like John Stark, for example. So Parkman's work is still being read now. And I think you can say that Parkman played a large role in rekindling the Rogers legend, if you like. But also another person who contributed to that was Kenneth Roberts in his novel Northwest Passage, which was a very good piece of work in its own right, very carefully researched. In fact, when I was researching White Devil, I consulted the research notes that were put together for Northwest Passage, and they're very detailed indeed. And of course, Northwest Passage was made into a film starring Spencer Tracy as Rogers, which again had a very big impact, and I'm sure had a big influence upon people who, for example, wanted to go on to portray Rangers within the reenacting community. And another aspect of this, in Northwest Passage, Rogers' rules for ranging, which he drew up for the British Army, just to basically say, well, this is how Rangers should operate. A version of those rules was incorporated within Northwest Passage in a more kind of slang version, if you like. And this was the set of rules that was used in Vietnam, for example, for issued to special forces operating in Vietnam. So they got popularized, and this was a factor which influenced portrayals as Rogers as the father of the modern day US Army Rangers. So that's another aspect of his legacy which endures today. So yeah, he has had an interesting trajectory, to say the least.
Yeah, interesting rehabilitation, to say the least.
Definitely,
say the least. Well, when you were writing White Devil, what was the most surprising or exciting new evidence that you uncovered?
Well, writing White Devil, it was one of those books where, of course, the deeper you dig into the story, the more things you uncover. But one of the things, I was very lucky when I was speaking at a conference in North America, I was approached by someone in the audience who said, "Oh, I've got something," who basically invited me to lunch and said, "I've got something I'd like you to see. Oh, something I think you might be interested in seeing." I thought, "Oh, that's very nice." So we went to lunch, and then I was ushered into a back room, and there on the table was the original map of Robert Rogers's raid on St. Francis, which this person, who was also a collector of colonial memorabilia, had acquired. And this gentleman very kindly made me a facsimile of this map, which was extremely important to me. I knew that a map existed somewhere out there, but no one knew where it was. To actually have this map, which is signed by Rogers and includes annotations of, oh, this is where we left our boats, this is where our party divided. And then I was able to try and relate that to the modern landscape. And there's certain key features, of course, like Lake Champlain and the St. Francis River, which allows you to kind of triangulate, and the Connecticut River, because Rogers marked this map with the way I came home, the way we came home. So you've got a dotted line. Anyway, that was a fantastic find. But one of the most interesting things I found, which actually links into Redcoats, because I came across it when I was researching Redcoats. And when I was researching that book, one of the most important sources was the court-martial records of the British Army, which survive from campaigns everywhere. And what basically they give you is snapshots of particular episodes where, for example, a soldier did something wrong for which he was brought to trial. And it could be throwing away his musket, deserting to the enemy, getting drunk. But people testified, and you have a a variety of witnesses who are all serving officers or soldiers, who will give you a very close insight into a particular incident. One of the cases I came across, which I instantly got very excited about, was of a Massachusetts provincial soldier called Jonathan Barnes, who had actually been brought to trial for being a traitor to his country. The reason he was brought to trial was because he'd been captured by the Abenaki Indians of St. Francis back in 1756, assimilated into the tribe, which wasn't at all uncommon with white captives, particularly young men. And by 1759, when Rogers attacked St. Francis and the Abenaki and French pursued his raiders, Jonathan Barnes was actually was in one of the war parties that pursued Rogers's men. And he actually ended up, according to the evidence in his court-martial, mistreating and killing, in fact, some of the rangers. So this was very exciting, because not only did it allow me to include this particular renegade within my storyline, but because of the detailed evidence, and this court-martial went on for several days, and there were multiple witnesses, it enabled me then to identify those witnesses from lists of prisoners, for example, who'd been released. And it allowed me to inject far more evidence into the story. There'd been stories of cannibalism, for example, which we had from particular accounts. But this evidence in the court-martial made it very clear that, yes, definitely, one of the British soldiers from Gage's light infantry was killed by the Abenaki was because he was carrying flesh, human flesh, and he'd actually killed a young boy who they'd taken with them as a captive, as a hostage. But as their supplies had run out when they were in the wilderness after leaving St. Francis, they were so desperate that they killed several of their captives, basically ate them. And this was hard evidence of something we kind of knew about, or I'd come across from vaguer sources, but here it was. Why would someone say that when this wasn't what the story was about? This wasn't what the trial was about. This was incidental to the evidence, but no one contradicted that witness. And I was able then to corroborate that evidence from other sources as well. So that's why I think that was, for me, perhaps the most interesting example. And then Jonathan Barnes, the renegade, ultimately was captured when the British took Montreal in 1760, and he was brought to trial. This was the court-martial, and when he was awaiting execution, he basically confessed to stuff he hadn't even mentioned as court-martial, which was even worse. One of the things he did, he actually was involved in the ritual killing of one of the men taken captive, who were of Rogers's rangers coming back from St. Francis, who was burned to death at a place called Ile Noire, Nut Island. And this was something we had been mentioned in other sources. But again, when you get that kind of the triangulation of two sources coming together, you know these things definitely happened. And Barnes was hanged as a traitor. So that was, I think, it was particularly exciting because it had never been used by anyone else. And as soon as, because people who'd previously written about Rogers weren't going through the British Army court-martial papers. And the reason I had done that is because I'd been doing that for another project, although I like to think I might have thought about looking at that source anyway, but who knows. So that was just something I had in my kind of memory bank, if you like, which I knew I could use if I ever wrote a book about Rogers.
Well, that's fascinating. Well, as we wrap up, what's the one or major takeaway from White Devil? What's the one thing that readers should really remember about this particular book?
Well, once again, I think you should always assume that there's the story you've been told. There's probably two sides to every story, or more than two sides. In fact, the story of White Devil, you've got the British side, you've got the Colonial American side, you've got the French Canadian side, you've got the Native American side. So that's at least four perspectives. And then within those different groups, you can then subdivide it even more. So I would say, there's different sides to every story, and stories change and evolve as you come across new information. I'm sure if someone else in 100 years' time or less takes another look at Rogers and St. Francis, maybe by then more evidence would have emerged. I know there's stuff I looked desperately for, I never found. For example, I never found a list, a muster roll of the men who went with Rogers to St. Francis, and it must have existed, because the comparable operations, you do have a muster list of those who went, this kind of thing. So I'm sure new light will emerge on certain aspects. But what I think writing White Devil did make me realize was, yeah, stories, narratives evolve, and there's no such thing as saying, oh, we know everything about this. No one's ever going to write the definitive account. You can't really do that, because when events happen 250, 300 years ago, the only people who really know what happened are long dead. And they, unfortunately, you know, unless they wrote journals or diaries, and even if they did, how honest were they about what they did? How good was their memory? If they did something bad, did they deliberately leave it out of the record? We just don't know. So once again, I think exploring history, particularly when you're dealing with a controversial episode, encourages you just to be a little bit more, you know, skeptical, just to dig a little deeper. That's the takeaway I'd get from it, I think.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, Stephen, thanks so much for joining me today. Really appreciate your input and to talk about your books.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Randy, and thank you for asking such thoughtful questions. Thank you.
Well, you're certainly welcome. To our viewers and listeners, I've been talking with Dr. Stephen Brumwell, author of Redcoats, The British Soldier in the Americas 1755 to 1763, and White Devil, a true story of war, savagery, and vengeance in colonial America. And for those of you who are interested in the years immediately preceding the American Revolution, I strongly encourage you to read both of these excellent books, Redcoats and White Devil. They're available at Amazon, Abe Books, and numerous other bookstores. So to our viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us. So long for now.